Now let's go on and let's look at these non-structural carbohydrates. So these are the components that are not part of the cell wall but are in the cell contents, in the middle of the cell. And these are the components that constitute the storage carbohydrate of the plant. This is an energy source for the plant. They're storing these non-structural carbohydrates as an energy source. And the storage carbohydrates of most forage crops are either fructans or starches. Let's begin by looking at fructans and the storage carbohydrates of grasses. So where we talk about non-structural carbohydrates, we can also refer to these as the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction, because grasses, as well as storing fructan and starches, also store simple sugars such as glucose, fructose and sucrose. And when we take fructan and we add on the simple sugars that are also present in the plant, this gives us the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction, abbreviated as WSC. And it's called water-soluble carbohydrate fraction because these carbohydrates are soluble in water. The water-soluble carbohydrate fraction, though, does not contain starch because starch is not soluble in water. So we have, when we're starting to think about non-structural carbohydrates, that's the NSC is the overall name because these are the carbohydrates associated with the cell contents, but we can break that down further into the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction plus the starch fraction. Let's talk though more about the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction, specifically now looking at fructan. Fructan, as I said, is the storage carbohydrate of many plants, in particular temperate grasses, that's grasses that grow in cooler seasons. And fructan is polymers of the sugar fructose. As I said, it's the major storage carbohydrate of many cool season grasses, so for example, timothy and ryegrass, and these fructans are primarily stored in the stem of the plant. What is important to remember about fructans is that although they are non-structural carbohydrates, so they're not part of the dietary fibre fraction of the plant, the horse is unable to digest fructans in the small intestine. The horse lacks the necessary endogenous enzymes to be able to break down the fructan into simple sugars to absorb across the small intestinal gut wall. So instead, these fructans pass through the small intestine and they go to the large intestine, and they're fermented in the same way as any dietary fibre would be fermented that entered the large intestinal environment. However, what we need to remember is the large intestinal environment of the horse is designed to process fibre, to degrade, to break down fibre, to use fibre, not to use non-structural carbohydrates. The large intestinal environment can tolerate some amounts of non-structural carbohydrates entering and can be fermented, but when these are in large amounts, this can cause disruption to the hindgut environment. And we talked a bit about that in week 1. So how do we analyse then the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction? Well, as its name suggests, it involves a water-soluble extract of the fructans and the simple sugars that are present in the plant. However, we can break this down a bit further to try to estimate the amount of actual simple sugars and the amount of fructan that's present in the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction. And we can use an analysis called ethanol-soluble carbohydrate, abbreviated as ESC. And if we use this analysis, this gives us a measure of the simple sugars that are present in the plant. And it can sometimes contain a little bit of starch, so we need to be aware of that. But what it does is it allows us to estimate how much of the water-soluble carbohydrate fraction is likely to be digested in the small intestine. And if we minus the ESC value from the WSC value, this will give us an estimate of the fructan content, which will allow us to estimate how much of that is likely to enter the hindgut.